First of all, thank you to Tarani for having me come up and speak. And I'm going to speak for about half an hour and answer some questions. And I know you've had a long day, so this is not going. I promise I do not have a graph in here. I will not talk really methods. My charge was to kind of talk about how one goes from being what I am, which is a straightforward anthropologist, social science, to working in an applied field. In my case, it's applied global health. I will talk more broadly because I think what I'd like to say is what I would have liked someone to have told me when I was starting out with my PhD many years ago. And in fact, I decided that, Tarani said I could speak about anything. So one of the things I'm going to talk about is my PhD, although it's been many years and it's an old study, but I just wanted to walk students through the reasoning of how you go from something that's a very narrow question into something that has had wider policy implications, and how I said this to someone earlier. There's a great quote from one of my favorite authors, who's Mark Twain, and it's, "If you don't know where you're going, you'll probably end up somewhere else." And that's true for a lot of research. But I also think that we sometimes don't, as we set out to do research, we don't ask the right questions, and we sometimes waste, and we certainly have students waste a lot of time and energy, or we don't have students ask the right questions or frame their research in the right way. And so a lot of the valuable time and energy they put into doing the research isn't used by people in the world around them. So let me just go through, and I'm terrible at following PowerPoint as well, so I'm sure I'll go back and forth a bit, but let me get started. Actually, I'm going to talk about two issues today. I'm going to talk about applying research to real-world problems, and then I'm going to talk about how you can take what research you have, and it doesn't matter if you're in the social sciences, humanities, the hard sciences, but translating the research you and the findings you get so it can be used to address real-world problems. They're not one and the same things. Part of it is because it's not just what your research is, but how you frame it when you present it that will make a difference. I'm not against theory. I should also say I'm going to talk about applied work. I'm not against theory at all. There's nothing as useful as a good theory. Theory helps frame debates. It's a conceptual framework that allows new sets of questions. It can allow you to tie your research into many other people's research. But theory alone, if you're trying to affect change by research, doesn't always translate into action. I'm also going to say that there's a growing need in many arenas for an evidence base. It's not that previously in things like the social sciences that we were evidence-free. So it wasn't that you didn't have data, but certainly like in anthropology, you could do a case study, you could do a field study, go off, talk to a small group of households, come back and say, aha, I now understand how food is distributed in household X in country Y, or I understand how a support network for women works in a particular culture. Those are very good things to know, but increasingly as many of the social sciences, many of the humanities, many of the hard sciences have merged with things like international development and policy and politics on a global level. It's no longer okay just to say I've done a small set of studies in a particular country and we will now extrapolate, take several million or several billions of dollars, make it a huge UNDP project and have it affect millions of people. We now know that you need more than anecdote, you need to work anecdote into something that gives you a larger range of information on a broader set of communities if you're really going to say that you can in good conscience scale up a project or put in a policy that may affect millions of people. So, turning policy into practice. There's some basic questions you should ask, and this is even before you start with decide on a research question, but we'll come back to a research question in a minute. What do you want to say? who do you want to say it to? So are you going to be talking to general public, to specific interest groups, politicians or government, fellow academics? Usually you'll have a variety of audiences. And how involved do you want to be in turning your findings into policy or practice? So what do you see your role as a researcher in on this? Often what we start is by, well, often what we don't ask enough, and we don't make students ask enough when they start out, is what question are you asking and why are you asking it? And I say down here someplace. Just because there's a data set available doesn't mean that you want to spend the next 3 years of your life analyzing it. So part of when we talk about a master's or PhD student thinking up what they want, or someone who's now grown up and is a professor someplace, it's the same thing. When you look at a question you want to ask, I think sometimes we go at it the wrong way. Instead of saying we have a data set, or instead of saying I'm sort of interested in X, Y, or Z, you should be sometimes saying, what good would it do? Or what communities do I work with, and what do we not know that would be helpful for them to know? Who would benefit by knowing this? Who else might be benefited? What difference does it make? In addition, framing questions, when I was in grad school, I did my master's and doctorate at Brown University in the United States, which has a very nice department of anthropology. And I was taught in classic fashion to come up with a hypothesis, then select a field site, then go test the hypothesis. Does this sound familiar to lots of people? Yeah, yeah. And some people are very good at that, and certainly my classmates were terrific at that. I'm terrible at that. I mean, I'm very good at thinking of ideas when I get to the field and I start talking to people. But sitting in a room devoid of air, staring into a computer, well, I predate computers, but it's staring into a blank sheet of paper and coming up with a hypothesis was something I found very difficult. So I'm going to come back to that in a minute. I'm going to describe how I kind of fell into a research topic. And if I hadn't fallen into that particular research topic, I'm not sure where I would be today, but I probably wouldn't be here addressing you in this particular arena. But let me cover a few other kind of background points I want to make first, and then I'll tell you some stories that hopefully will bring all of this into some sort of perspective. Often, even before, by the way, a word on methods, since it's a methods fair. Often, even before we ask what question, we talk about what method. Are you a qualitative or quantitative researcher, right? A lot of you have been you'll learn a little qualitative if you're a quant person. You'll learn a little quant if you're a qualitative person. Or if you're like me and very qualitative, you'll never learn any quant, you'll just look desperate. But this is not, we frame it as though it's opposing football teams. This is not the way to ask the researchers to work in some ways. What we need to do is think in terms of, first, what's the question? And then I see it as kind of a feedback loop. And I should go back, and I should have an arrow coming back. But often, qualitative is very good for getting, for understanding questions, interviews, focus groups. You know, you've been spending all day with this, so I'm not going to go over it. But I see it as a natural progression, especially if you're doing things like I do, where I work a lot on global health issues, especially around people with disabilities. And we need both qualitative and quantitative data. So I need to go into a community and observe something, or I'll hear something. We talk about it as sometimes, that's just an anecdote. I sat through a faculty meeting not that long ago at UCL where some very famous quantitative researchers were talking about, they'd heard someone say something, someone else say something. It was around a medical issue, and they said, oh, that's anecdote. Well, you get enough anecdote together and it starts looking like data to me. But often what you do is when you start with a question, or you start with an observation, or you half hear something in passing, or something just rings a bell. Often it doesn't come out of thin air, so you need to have some background. You need to go through take the introductory courses so that you have a platform on which to build. But often what you start with is qualitative. But at a certain point, as you get the focus groups, the interview groups, you need to also kind of, it would be like on a continuum. Your question then should roll over into, okay, I've observed this. I'm looking at literacy levels in a small population of girls in Peru. That's fine. Now that you've talked to the girls, you've talked to their families, you've talked to their teachers, how many girls are affected? So are we talking just about a small community of girls? Or are we going to then say, let us talk about, now that we've got the parameters, how many girls are affected? Let's do a survey or questionnaire. Now can we extrapolate that information so that we can talk about it in terms of thousands of girls, or hundreds of thousands of girls, or national policy, or international policy. So what you observe in a small classroom can be extrapolated, and you find yourself talking to UNESCO about what you found. But first you need to go along that continuum and roll qualitative into quantitative, and vice versa. If you start with a large number like a large-scale survey, you want to know not just how many people think something or do something, you want to know why. And qualitative also, at the end, explains why. And so I see them as intricately part of the same thing and not as contesting methodologies. So I understand that I think everybody's more comfortable on one side of the continuum than the other in terms of qualitative or quantitative, but be insistent as independent researchers. You yourselves should define the question and then use all the methods you think are important in order to make the case you want to. And I think that part of it is just to say to students, you have permission. This is your research. You decide what's best for you, which is not to say that your professors aren't older and wiser and won't guide you well. But if you think that you've got something that needs both qualitative and quantitative, or needs different methodologies, and there are other methodologies, I just put in a few: observation, local history, oral history, folklore. These things are important to understand how and why people think, work, have social networks. Put in what you think you need. Let me give you an example. My PhD project. I did work on a very scenic island off the coast of Massachusetts in the United States. And I went to, and the island's called Martha's Vineyard. And I went to the island for a reason that had nothing to do with the research, actually. I was a first-year graduate student at Brown. I had met this really cute guy, who I'd been married to for the last 35 years, so there was another story there. And he was going off to the island we were like, Brown is in Providence, Rhode Island, so this is about an hour away. He was going to the island to meet with a local fiddle player, because my husband Larry plays guitar, and he wanted to meet a local fiddle player. The local fiddle player happened also to be the island historian, a lovely guy named Gail Huntington. And it turns out that Gail and his wife, Mildred, were really lovely people, and they kept inviting us back, and we were impoverished grad students, so we kept going back to the island. And Gail's favorite thing to do in the world, I think, was to get in his car with, usually with me, because I'd listen to his stories, and drive around the island of Martha's Vineyard at like 5 miles an hour, drinking some of the local old Newbury port rum, and talking about local history. And in doing that one day, he said, "Oh, Ben Mayu lived there, and he did this, he did that, he was a fisherman, and the island term was deaf and dumb." And being a really eager beaver graduate student, I paid no attention to that at all. I said, "Oh, that's nice." It was only coming back on the same drive, Gail now reduced to 3 miles an hour because he'd been liquored up a bit. It's, and with a trail of tourist cars behind us, everybody honking and trying to get him out of the way. That Gail said, "Oh, Ben's brother lived there, and he was deaf and dumb too." "Oh," I said, "What? Both of them were deaf and dumb?" "Yeah." He said, there were a couple of people around who were deaf. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a introduction to biological anthropology course flickered the concept of founder's effect. And I thought, oh, maybe, maybe this will make a nice short paper for my first year. I forget what the class was. I think it was, I forget what it was. Whatever it was, I said, oh, I'll ask a few more questions next time I'm on the island. Well, it turns out that there were more than a couple of people deaf. There were a lot of people deaf on the island. They were deaf for about 300 years. I won't go into the particulars. But what I started to do was, first I talked to Gail. And when I sat down with Gail, and I said, tell me more about these deaf people, turns out there were not only a lot of deaf people, but then I asked him, so did everybody, did these deaf people, did they have a hard time understanding you, and how did you communicate with them? He said, oh, well, there was no problem. Everyone here spoke sign language, is what he said. I said, not everyone. He said, sure, I speak it, my wife speaks it. He wandered into the kitchen, came out with some more rum, and he didn't drink rum all the time, but it turned out that the island had adapted for about 300 years, had adapted by many people who were hearing, learning sign language. So what did I need to do in order to answer? So I said, I think I'm going to do this. This sounds interesting. I'm not quite sure what field it falls into, but it sounds like something that would be a good, interesting thing to do for a PhD thesis. Plus, I was getting desperate. Everybody else had sat there with a hypothesis. They'd figured out what they were going to do. So I essentially did an oral history of a genetic disorder for my thesis. To obtain the data, I did oral history, I had to do history, I did focus groups, interviews. I don't have interviews there, but I did lots of interviews. I did questionnaires. It fell into the field of public health and disability studies, although that really wasn't a field at the time. I was doing anthropology. I had to do sociolinguistics because it was sign language. I did genetics. I had to trace all the families back. I won't go into all the specifics, but let us just say that we know where the gene came from. It comes from the Kentish Weald. I even know the boat that the people carrying the gene came over on. They came over to the United States on a boat called the Griffin in 1691, and it was an oral history project. So I started with a question that seemed interesting to me, and I also had a lot of qualms. I knew I wanted to do something that was applied, but at the time there was no applied field. I also varied between, and anybody who's written a thesis knows this, you vary between thinking that everybody in the world will read the thesis as it comes out, and when it's made into the feature-length motion picture, you'll be all set for life, and thinking even my mother won't read this one, right? Well, here, my conclusions were, very briefly, I won't go into, but basically I found the deaf population was fully integrated into the surrounding community because everybody adapted to the disability instead of what we do in our society, ask disabled people to do a lot of the adapting. And so my my conclusion was that many of the assumptions about disabilities that were socially constructed, I was doing this in the early 1980s. And then, my final conclusion was if a society made minor adjustments, like more people learning sign language, people with disabilities could participate more fully in the community around them. Now that's fairly commonplace, but at the time there was a real controversy raging. There was something called the Global Disability Rights Movement, which was just getting going, and disabled people were saying, and they were right in saying this, it's not us, it's a surrounding society, it's stigma, it's prejudice, it's lack of understanding. And the response from the medical community, from policymakers, from lots of people in the early 1980s was, yeah, we understand what you're saying, but it's not really valid because show us one place in the world where disabled people have been fully integrated into society. So here I was, a dumb graduate student, and I wandered into this controversy. So suddenly I found myself involved in a very applied issue very quickly. So I published a small, my first publication was in something called, was in Natural History magazine, which is, it's like the Smithsonian magazine. It's like the Natural History magazine thing. It's a well-distributed magazine in the States. It's not peer-reviewed, but I didn't know that. They wanted an article, and it had a large readership, and I thought, you know, it was like a couple of columns, and I got hundreds of letters, you know, which was new to me because nobody who writes a graduate student, and a lot of them were people from the disability rights movement in the United States say, thank God, we've been saying this for years, and you found an example, 60 miles from Boston. So suddenly I found myself, and I was really unprepared for it, being asked to be involved in not just publishing the work, but also I was brought in kind of by an advocacy community. I had to find myself giving testimony in front of legislatures. I was on, my work was featured on things like National Public Radio and NPR, and the BBC did something on it. And so suddenly, individuals and families started to write me about the research, and still do. I still regularly get a note from somebody who's come across the book, you know, or come across it, you know, what did I think, or how did I, you know, how would I construct this or that. My research also contributed to the broader movement. So the Americans with Disabilities Act was coming up in front of Congress a few years later, and people were quoting from the book. I was involved in setting up something called the Society for Disability Studies in the States under the leadership of Irving Zola, who was a sociologist who was really one of the leading thinkers on disability rights, and a lovely guy from Brandeis University. And it led to a number of different research topics. But it was, I'm giving you this example because I was dragged kind of into, willingly, I must say. I was very pleased that people used my research. And I think it gave me a taste for how research could be used. But it was also quite unexpected in some ways. If I'd been more aware and was asking broader questions at the time, I would have known more about the disability rights movement. The disability rights movement has gone on. In 2006. The United Nations passed a UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled Persons with Disabilities. So, and again, my research, along with many other people's research, was very helpful in building a case for giving human rights to the 690 million or so people with disabilities worldwide. So it went from essentially my research to contributing to a large body of research that affected UN policy. But good data doesn't automatically translate into policy or practice. I'm going to give you an example of this guy. Who is this guy?
Mendel.
Yes, who said Mendel? Very good. And why am I putting him up here?
Because he was the first person to recognize the main laws of hereditary.
Yeah. And why am I putting it up? Yeah, Gregor Mendel. Why was 1866 a big year for him? Because that's when he got his, I think, his only publication. It was in the Journal of the Brno Natural History Society. Okay? Why was 1900 a bigger year for him? Because that's when three researchers working independently stumbled across his obscure paper, realized the implications of it, and suddenly you had Mendelian genetics. Why was 1884 not a good year for him? That's when he died. So he was dead for several decades before anybody realized the issues around his work. So just because you have a good idea, and there was a huge and building discussion on eugenics through the 1880s, 1890s, some very repressive legislation, and it was actually the eugenicists that came back and found him. But I'm always amused when especially in this country, there are ways of assessing how effective your research is by how many people cite you. And in fact, Mendel's a perfect example for why scholarship doesn't always go according to plan. And even when you have something very valuable to say, people don't always read it. And so a lot of this kind of, you know, where are you publishing and what, you know, that whole joke about why God wouldn't get tenure? Self-published, no peer review. Okay. So I would argue that moving research into policy or practice is a process, that you need to take some responsibility for participating in this process if you think you have something to say. If you don't, that's fine. Or you did something theoretical, or you had a delightful time doing the research, but you don't think it has relevance, that's fine. But if you're putting time and energy into this stuff, you should be asking a relevant question. If you're not asking a relevant question, then move on to another question. Finish your thesis and move on to another question. Finish that project. But you should be doing it not just because there's funding for it or because you have to get it done. There's enough good questions out there where finding a difference, finding an answer will make a difference. And there are few enough people like you who have the skills to do that, so that every one of your questions should at least be put through a lens, and you should be saying, why am I doing it, and is it worth my time? And my time is valuable.